see there are only two kind of people in the world. Those who grow, others just swell. And those of you who are high school students have the chance to grow. Those of us who are more senior in age, we've already gotten our ideas and our thoughts crystallized. We are reluctant to change. We're talking today about the balance between church and state. It's a topic that's very hot today. Seldom, if anybody, is ever neutral on the subject. Ultra-conservative politicians will rant and rave, raise clenched fists, and shout in the air with impassioned pleas that Almighty God and the zeal for patriotism are inseparable. And some of their supporters go so far to say that America is really a Christian nation. You might even hear some of these tonight say that. On the flip side, there are more liberal watchdogs who carry picket signs and walk up and down in front of City Hall, and they want to get rid of anything resembling religion, get rid of all 10 Commandments, get rid of displays of manger scenes at Christmas time. And they say they even want those of you in high school to get rid of the word God in the Pledge of Allegiance. Which extreme is right? Neither one. Neither one. There are those of you who would toss aside any reference to faith by our government, we remind you that our founding fathers of this experiment called a democracy believed that the new nation would survive only if it relied on Almighty God for strength and guidance. Now, the former speaker here, a very intelligent, articulate man, Mr. Friedman, stated this: determining the original intent of the framers is difficult, if not impossible. Not in all things. In this one thing there is no mistake. The Mayflower Compact acknowledged the sovereignty of Almighty God. The Declaration of Independence said those words that every one of us has heard before. All men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. In his first inaugural address, President George Washington expressed the feeling of the country when he said this: "It would be particularly improper to omit in this first official act my fervent supplications to that Almighty God who rules over the universe, that his benediction may consecrate to the liberties and happiness of the people of the United States a government." Even the Washington Monument, the tallest building in Washington, 555 feet tall, on the top of which is an aluminum cap that says in Latin, Laus Deo, which means praise to God. Now, lest the overly pious among us raise a righteous eyebrow, it's also clear that the United States was never formed as a nation for Christians only. Instead, the framers of this new republic refused to incorporate a state religion. Simple as that. They insisted on creating a government in which the people are free to express their religious faith without fear of persecution. It should come as no surprise then that the very First Amendment of our Constitution guarantees that you and I that no one religion would prevail in the government, and the same amendment assures that you and I would not be prohibited by any government for the free exercise thereof. From whence do we get the battle cry, separation of church and state? Not on any official document of the country, but it was by a private letter written by Thomas Jefferson to a friend of his. American presidents had different ideas on this idea of religion. None of, however, denied the fact that America was founded on the belief in Almighty God and the prayer that God would support us. Now, there's a new book out called God in the Oval Office, written by yours truly. It charged $14 for this thing, but it's well worth it. At least I think so. But the James Monroe, Millard Fillmore, Chester Arthur were very silent on this. John Adams was rather antagonistic when he said, "This would be the best of all possible worlds if there were no religion in it at all." However, the vast majority of people who occupied the Oval Office, Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, openly expressed their feelings on religion. President Lincoln one time confessed, "I sometimes feel I have nowhere else to go in this Oval Office than to drop my knees and go to God in prayer." And remember, during Jimmy Carter still teaches adult Sunday school. in Plains, Georgia. President George W. Bush, when he was asked during the 2000 presidential debate who his greatest influence on his life, he said openly, Jesus was, Christ was. Teddy Roosevelt, who was also a guy who had what they call muscular Christianity, talked about his faith. He would go to church and sing the hymns. He loved to sing the bass part of the hymns. And you could always tell when the president was in church, not because they could see him, but because they could hear him. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt one time said his concept of heaven is that it incorporated the greatest choir of all the voices in history, in which it had 10,000 of the world's greatest sopranos, 10,000 of the world's greatest altos, 10,000 of the world's greatest tenors, and he said, I'll sing bass. That's Teddy Roosevelt. Thomas Jefferson was correct, however. The separation between church and state must remain, but this does not give the government a license to ignore religion. Could it be that freedom of religion ought never be confused with freedom from religion? Those of you who are in high school, one final word. Some of you feel that some of your teachers are pushing you a little bit too far when they overload you with maybe homework, too much homework. You think more than you deserve. In reality, no. Only the teacher who loves you enough to have you go the nth degree is the one who will do this. A teacher took several students to a cliff and said, jump. And this one student said, no, it's too high. Jump, demanded the teacher. No, it's too dark. Jump, demanded the teacher. No, I'm afraid. Jump! And one of the students jumped, and behold, he flew.
The title for my talk, I'm going to take a little bit of different direction than we've had this morning. The title for my talk is Red God, Blue God. Is there a God gap in American politics? And my intention in this is not to make a partisan point, but to simply make a point about why we're even having this discussion in the first place. So I want to, instead of revisiting the ground that we've been talking about this morning about the proper relationship of how we ought to understand and interpret the First Amendment of the Constitution, I thought I'd take us into a different direction and address this question. Why does it appear to be a God gap between our nation's two political parties? What lies beneath the headlines of recent research that appears to show that the more religious a person is, the more likely they are to vote Republican? Also, what is the enduring tie that causes Republicans to get this right more often than Democrats? The reason I ask that is because last summer, during the Republican convention, I was asked to be on a panel in New York by President Clinton's former chief of staff, John Podesta, and President Clinton's press spokesman, Michael McCurry, and a professor from Wesley Theological Seminary, professor of social ethics, to be on a panel to talk about this so-called God gap. And it was me versus them. That was their idea of diversity. And on the panel, before we got there, Michael McCurry put this question to me. He said, why do Republicans seem to get this right most of the time? And so we might ask ourselves, why is this? Why is there so much religious language and rhetoric from our political leaders? Well, because our political leaders understand the reverberation went away, did it? I hear reverberation. That's better now. Our political leaders are aware that America is a highly religious country, full of people with diverse but deep religious convictions. Here's a fact. More Americans attend church on Sunday mornings than attend weekend football games, and that includes high school, college, and pro football games combined. And this is not something new. Throughout our history, religious values have always been a part of the American public debate. The argument has never been whether religious believers ought to be involved in social and political movements. The claim that the faith of religious believers should always be only an intensely private affair between the individual and God would have been surprising news to such persons as John Winthrop, Jonathan Edwards, John Wesley, Abraham Lincoln, Dorothy Day, the abolitionists of slavery, 15 generations of the African American church, civil rights leaders, and anti-war activists. The argument among religious believers has always been on what matters they should be most concerned and the most prudent ways to express that concern in the public arena. But there's also something else going on. Several important polls recently have shown us this. Except for race, religious involvement is the most powerful predictor of how someone will vote. It's more powerful than income, more powerful than education, than gender or any other social demographic category. A poll by the Pew Research Center for People in the Press conducted in the summer of 2003 found out this. 87% of Americans say that religion is important in their life. 70% of Americans say they want their president, this is a very important statistic, 70% of Americans want their president to be a person of faith. 64% of registered voters say their personal beliefs and their faith will help shape the way they vote for president. Now that was in 2003. Just last month, in another nationwide survey conducted by the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life and the Pew Research Center for People in the Press, the results showed that 55% of voters surveyed said the GOP is more religion-friendly than the Democrats, who were perceived to be religion-friendly by only 29% of the respondents, which is down from that previous poll I just quoted, down from 40%. So it went from 40% to 29%. So among the sample, a majority, 51% to 28%, see the Republican Party as most concerned with protecting religious values. Now, this new poll also pointed out the public remains generally comfortable with politicians mentioning their religious faith. In fact, most continue to say there is too little of religious expression by the political leaders. So how do we count for these polls that appear to show the Republican Party more religious friendly? And despite the best efforts by people like Jim Wallace and Amy Sullivan, why is it the Democratic Party seems to be less this way? Again, I'm not making a partisan point. I'm trying to make a sociological point. And if you're a Democratic consultant here, you need to hear this data. It'll help for the next election. I want to suggest that we might be asking, however, the wrong question. Instead of wondering why so many devoted religious believers are becoming Republicans, we might wonder why so many secular non-believers are becoming Democrats. The Democratic pollster Stanley Greenberg has described secular voters as, quote, the true loyalists of the Democratic Party, estimating that they make up 15% of the party's base, which is almost the same size as the white evangelical base on the Republican side. And in an important essay in the very distinguished social science journal, The Public Interest, in the fall of 2002, two political scientists argue in an essay entitled Our Secularist Democratic Party, that's the title of the article, Our Secularist Democratic Party, that the Democratic Party has become the political home of non-believers. They argue that a dramatic shift occurred at the Democratic Convention in 1972. They say, and I quote, prior to the late 1960s, there was something of a tacit commitment among the elites in both parties that the Judeo-Christian traditions regarding authority and sexual mores and the families, there was a tacit commitment by both parties on those values. But the nomination of George McGovern shattered that consensus on the Democratic side, where over a third of the white delegates fit the definition at that convention as being secularists, compared with only 5% of the general population that fell in that category nationwide. Now, I'm throwing a lot of percentages out, but I'm just trying to make a point. By the way, the word secularist in this study means those who reject any kind of biblical or scriptural authority. They have no religious affiliation. They never attend religious services or pray. And they say religion provides simply no guidance in their daily life. I also want to observe, parenthetically, that there are two kinds of secularists. Those who are hostile to religion and see it as dangerous and socially damaging phenomenon that stands in the way of all progress. And then there are secularists who are simply indifferent to religion. They don't care whether you're religious or not. Now, as secularists have become more numerous, they've become an important Democratic voting bloc. And this presents a very important dilemma for the Democratic Party. The two political scientists in the Public Interest said this: the religious gap among white voters in the 1992, 96, and 2000 presidential election was more important than any demographic or social cleavages in the electorate. It was much larger than the gender gap, more significant than any combination of differences in education, income, occupation, age, marital status, and regional groupings. The authors concluded that secularists are a large and loyal bloc in the Democratic constituency. It's larger than organized labor. And they point out in the 2000 election that both comprised about 16% of the white electorate, and both backed Albert Gore with 2/3 of their votes. Moreover, these scholars highlighted the rise of what they call a new kind of voter. That voter is what they call the anti-fundamentalist and anti-evangelical voter. They wrote, the results indicate that over the past decade, persons who intensely dislike conservative Christians have found a partisan home in the Democratic Party. President Clinton captured 80% of these voters in his victories over President Bush Sr. in 1992, and Senator Dole 4 years later Al Gore picked up 70% of the anti-conservative Christian vote in the 2000 election. One has to reach back to the pre-New Deal America to find a period when voting behavior was influenced by this degree of antipathy toward a religious group. Now, in conclusion, as a result of this, here's the challenge, according to these authors, for the Democratic Party. Quote, gaining solid support from the anti-fundamentalists and evangelical voters has become crucial to achieving victories at the national level, just as Republicans need to win the evangelical vote without scaring off religious moderates. So, too, must Democrats mobilize secularists and the anti-fundamentalists without becoming too identified in public discourse as the party hostile to religion. So back to the original point. What lies beneath the headlines of research that appear to show that the more religious a person is, the more likely they are to vote Republican? Or as Michael McCurry put it to me, why do Republicans do this better than we do? As the research I've cited has shown, over the past decade, persons who intensely dislike religious conservative believers have found a partisan home in the Democratic Party. Republicans, on the other hand, do not have a strong constituency within their own ranks who are hostile religious conservatives, at least not yet. If Pat Robertson keeps it up, it'll happen. But at least not yet. The Republican Party doesn't have a group that's intensely hostile to religious conservatives. And because religious conservatives are like all of us in this room, desiring to be taken seriously and treated with dignity and respect, they're more pleased with the reception they're receiving from the Republican Party, who often react more positively to the religious core values intrinsic to their own identity as Americans.
I'm a sitting circuit judge in Seminole County. I think I was added to the panel just to add some realism to it, if you will. I haven't written any books and I haven't lectured. But I've been asked to give some actual examples of government being involved in religion and then talk to you a little bit about the Pledge of Allegiance cases, which you might be interested in. As a sitting trial judge, I think the best way to describe that is that's where the U.S. religious law rubber meets the road. When you speak of government involvement in religion, probably the most fertile ground for that is in the trial courts. I have 1,800 cases assigned to me, 700 civil cases, and 1,100 family divorce cases. The statistics tell us that somewhere between 40 and 60% of marriages end in divorce. And that would suggest that as many as 60% of you young folks in this audience have been touched by divorce. As a judge, I have been asked to decide whether a 5-year-old girl should be raised Jewish or Lutheran. As a judge, I have been asked to order that a father continue to take his son to Catholic confirmation classes. As a judge, I have been asked to order that a mother be permitted to have the children every Sunday morning so that she can take the children to church. Just last week, I was asked to order that an allegedly abusive husband not attend the church where his wife attends. How many of you would want me, a trial judge, to decide what religion you're going to practice? How many of you would want me, a trial judge, to order that you cannot attend a particular church on a particular Sunday? That, in a very real sense, is what government involvement in religion can lead us to. For many years, I was a school board attorney. And I had a partner who was fond of saying jokingly that he was all for prayer in school so long as he got to write the prayer. Prayer in school, as we've heard today, and as we've known for some time, for the past 50 years or so, has been a very divisive and contentious issue in our legal system. And the history of the school prayer cases is kind of a good introduction to the Pledge of Allegiance cases. The so-called Fountainhead school prayer case was a case called Engel versus Vitale in 1962. where the Supreme Court determined that a program of daily classroom prayer was a religious activity and that it violated the Constitution. The court, though, drew explicit distinctions between patriotic invocations of God on one hand and religious exercises such as prayer on the other. Justice Douglas, who was on the court at that time, in a concurring opinion, specifically commented that the phrase in the Pledge of Allegiance, "under God," was recognizing only the guidance of God in our national affairs and was not a religious exercise. In 1963, the court in Abington School District versus Shemp was asked to consider whether or not a Pennsylvania statute that required every day the reading of 10 verses from the Holy Bible and to open the school day, and then the class be led in the Lord's Prayer, and finally that the class pledge allegiance. The court had very little difficulty in striking down the reading of the 10 verses from the Bible and the recitation of the Lord's Prayer, but it said nothing about the pledge being unconstitutional. And Justice Brennan, concurring, said that the reference to the divinity in the revised pledge merely recognizes the historical fact that our nation was believed to have been founded under God. Thus, reciting the pledge may be no more of a religious exercise than reading aloud Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, which contains an allegation to the same historical fact. Next in line was Wallace versus Jaffrey in 1985, where an Alabama statute requiring a 1-minute period of silence in public schools for meditation or voluntary prayer was held to be unconstitutional. And in that case, the court looked at the intent of the legislature when it drafted the statute and said the wholly religious character of the challenged law was plainly evident from its text. And Justice O'Connor, who, as we know, has just retired, wrote separately saying that a moment of silence was not a religious exercise and thus was constitutional. She further said that the words "under God" in the pledge serve as an acknowledgement of religion with a legitimate secular purpose of solemnizing public occasions and expressing confidence in the future. Finally, the Lee versus Wiseman case, which you heard about earlier, where clergy was offered prayers as part of the official school graduation ceremony. The audience was asked to stand for the pledge and then for the prayer. Justice Kennedy, joined by Justice Blackmun, Stevens, O'Connor, and Souter, wrote that it was not truly a voluntary exercise, and conducting formal religious observances conflicts with settled rules pertaining to prayer exercises for students. But the court went out of its way to say that we do not hold that every state action implicating religion is invalid if one or a few citizens find it offensive. A relentless and all-pervasive attempt to exclude religion from every aspect of public life could itself become inconsistent with the Constitution. The school prayer cases basically turn on compelled attendance of students, the impressionable age, and the so-called indirect coercion that comes from the students having to either participate or feel like they would be ostracized if they didn't participate. Which leads us to the school Pledge of Allegiance cases. As you probably know, in 2002, the Ninth Circuit in California, out on the left coast, held that the Pledge of Allegiance in public schools was unconstitutional. This came about because of a father named Michael Newdow, who was an avowed atheist, who sued alleging that the requirement that his daughter participate in the Pledge of Allegiance was unconstitutional. The court, the Ninth Circuit, initially found that Mr. Newdow had standing. Standing is a legal concept that says you have the right to bring a cause of action. Mr. Newdow and this little girl's mother were divorced, and the mother they had joint custody, but the mother had exclusive legal authority over the child. So Mr. Newdow sued to enjoin the school district from requiring the recitation of the pledge. He sued the U.S. Congress, he sued President Bush, he sued the governor of California, he sued the school district, he sued a bunch of congressmen, and he asked that the court order Congress to change the pledge and take out the words "under God." California law at that time, or even today, required that every public elementary school day began with an appropriate patriotic exercise. That's what the statute says. The statute goes on to say that pledging allegiance satisfies that requirement. And then Elk Grove Unified School District had adopted a rule implementing that statute, requiring that each elementary class recite the pledge once each day. Consistent with established U.S. law, the district permitted any student who objected to saying the pledge on religious grounds or other reasons to abstain from recitation. Back in 1943, the Supreme Court had said that requiring Jehovah's Witnesses to recite the pledge was unconstitutional. And so it's been the law since 1943. You can't require the recitation of the pledge. Mr. Newdow's case went up to the Ninth Circuit out of the California District Court, and it went up 3 times, and they had a big debate over whether he had standing. They finally ignored standing altogether and sent it up to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Ninth Circuit is made up of 24 judges. The panel that heard the Newdow case consists of 3 judges. 1 of them dissented, and 2 of them wrote the opinion. So 2 out of 24 judges decided the Newdow case. And the 3rd time around, there was a request that it be heard en banc, that is, that all of the judges sit and hear the case. And that was denied, and 9 judges dissented in that. So at least 10 of the 24 judges did not agree with that opinion. But it went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court dodged it on the standing issue. They decided that Mr. Newdow did not have standing to bring the suit on behalf of his daughter, and they reversed it. Mr. Newdow then filed a new suit where he sued Congress and the President and others again on his own behalf and on behalf of 2 other parents and their children, and the standing issue has been resolved. The case was decided by the District Court, and the District Court of California said it was bound by the Ninth Circuit opinion, even though it had been reversed by the U.S. Supreme Court. What we have now is the Ninth Circuit has said the pledge is unconstitutional, the Fourth Circuit has said it is constitutional, and the Seventh Circuit has said it's constitutional. So without doubt, it's going to go back up to the Supreme Court. Eventually, the Supreme Court will hopefully confront the issue and decide whether it is or is not constitutional.
In the election of 1976, when dinosaurs ruled the earth and I was a senior at this fine institution, the Republican Party nominated a very decent man, President Gerald Ford, who was strapped with the overwhelming burdens of runaway inflation and having pardoned Richard Nixon, who at that time was as maligned as Darth Vader. If the 1972 Democratic Convention was a bright line, as you suggest, how would you account for that convention nominating Jimmy Carter, who was a devoutly religious man, and to my knowledge the only modern president to have written books such as In Living Faith based on religion? How would you make that distinction?
Well, I thought it was a very smart decision. I mean, the fact of the matter is the Democratic Party candidates who've done well are people like Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter who are comfortable talking about their faith. Whatever their flaws are, both personally or politically, they're comfortable about talking about their faith. And so the fact of the matter is that the Democratic Party ought to look back just in its short history to see that the candidates who do this well were Southern Baptists, in this case, who could talk about faith in public life. I mean, for whatever his flaws, Bill Clinton knew how to talk about Scripture and knew how to preach. I get a lot of calls from members of the press who, especially European press, who want to know, isn't this odd that President Bush is talking about God so much? And I said, odd? Jimmy Carter taught Sunday school while he was President of the United States of America. Bill Clinton has spoken 3 times in more churches than George Bush has ever been in. It's not odd. This is America. So it's the fact of the matter is that the dilemma for the Democratic Party then is to find candidates, and I think they will, who are comfortable, you know, when talking about their faith. Because Michael McCurry, who put this panel on in New York, went as a consultant to the Kerry campaign, and right after 2 days after he started work, Kerry started talking about the fact that he was an altar boy. I mean, McCurry is a Methodist layman in Rockville, Maryland, and very serious about his faith. And he put this panel on because he was concerned about his own party. We're not doing this right. And so as soon as he came onto the Kerry campaign about 4 months before the election, all of a sudden Senator Kerry starts talking about, oh, by the way, I used to be an altar boy. I'm a member of the Catholic Church. And you just saw this, sort of this rush of, we forgot to say anything about religion. And so the word is getting around, and I think that's why, for instance, this book by Jim Wallace, which in my opinion is just an awful book. It's a pathetic book, but it's a bestseller. And I know Jim personally, but I mean, I think the politics of the book are nuts. But it's a bestseller because it's saying the Democratic Party learn to speak in a public language and public theology way that appeals to the broader part of America. So all I'm saying is that was a wise thing to do in 76. I think they might have learned their lesson in 72, from 72.
Unless the Democrat Party knows how to comfortably deal with the subject of religion, do they have a chance of ever again winning a national election?
You find a candidate who can talk comfortably in a way that appeals to, I'm trying to think who those people might be. I mean, you know, the fact of the matter is Senator Clinton has already started talking when she goes around the country about how much she likes the faith-based initiative of President Bush. You've already got people who are moving to the center on those questions and talking in a way, in a rhetoric that, you know, that Senator Clinton's talking about, prayer groups she meets with him in Washington. In other words, you just only have to send so many signals for American people to feel like, okay, you're one of us, or you. These surveys that I quoted from the Pew, oh, that's not a yes or no answer, is it? But it was an answer that required more than a yes or no. Yes, of course, they can. They can, yes.
Do you feel that our government right now has a correct degree of involvement of federal funding in religious institutions, and governments and religions are adequately involved in the federal government and so on? Or do you feel that we have to have more or less of that, or are we on track?
I think as we learned this morning from some of the very fine papers we heard earlier, that we don't need more government involvement in religion. But that doesn't mean we don't need more religious people involved in government. And so the public square should not be naked. Religious people can be involved in the public square. But as I think one of the speakers in the last panel pointed out, all the countries that have state involvement in religion are dying churches. So we don't need the government involvement. What we need is religious believers involved in government to bring their moral values, their virtues, their character traits, their integrity, one would hope, to the public arena, so that those values influence debates about the war on terror, about welfare policy, which is now going to be redebated in this country in an intense and important way, and it should be. But they should bring those values to the public arena.
And the other distinction is the difference between faith and religion. Faith is something which you believe. Religion is how you express that belief. And one word of caution to those who are very, very pious. The one group of people with whom Jesus had the most trouble in his day were the religious people, the scribes and the Pharisees. God always told us to have a faith, never a religion.
My question is basically about this whole concept with the Pledge of Allegiance. We've had, the Pledge of Allegiance was first recognized by Congress in 1923, which roughly means we've been without a pledge for somewhere between 300 and 135 years. And Judge Simmons mentioned the case in 1942 with the Supreme Court saying the pledge is voluntary, so my question ends up becoming, why are we still debating this? It's already been decided.
Let me add to that. You are partially correct. The phrase "under God" was not added until President Eisenhower's
1955.
term, and that was because of a Lincoln Day address in which the speaker suggested we insert those terms, those words "under God," which he did. As a result, that's the area which is debated, not the entire pledge, but those two words.
Yes, I understand. I was just curious.
The pledge actually was adopted in 1942 during the height of World War II out of a patriotic fervor. And then, as the Reverend points out, it was amended in 1954, and they specifically, the sponsor of that amendment indicated that the words "under God" were intended to draw a distinction between communism, which was atheist, and this country, which was founded on a religious belief. And that's where the debate has arisen since then.
Would you take the phrase "endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights" out of the Declaration of Independence?
No, but
Well, then what's the difference?
it wasn't added later. That was the original document.
Justice O'Connor spoke about that in one of her concurring opinions, that it's the "under God" phrase has been in the pledge now for 50 years, so it takes on sort of a historical unity, and that was part of one of her concurring comments, that she probably would support that. Of course, she's no longer on the court.
With the recent decisions on federal funding or lack of federal funding for stem cell research and the difficulty of making the morning after pill available over the counter, these were religious decisions and not scientific decisions. Would you say this country is drifting towards a theocracy? Yes.
These decisions were guided by people, some who were religious and based their ethical decisions about very deeply serious bioethical questions in their religious belief and in their personal political beliefs. Other people, a part of that debate, who are not religious believers, held the same views as those people did based on the natural law. If you want to argue that religious people cannot bring religious values to the public square, then you can't even argue about the Civil Rights Act. We had some civil rights laws in this country on the basis of the fact that people are made in the image of God and should be treated with respect and dignity, and therefore those motivating ethical views rooted in Christian tradition guided the civil rights movement. Now, if you want to follow the logic of what you're suggesting, then everybody involved in the civil rights movement should not have brought their public beliefs into the public square.
There was no
I don't think you want that.
There was no scientific involvement in those decisions, but thank you.
Well, these debates are rooted in both ethical beliefs and also scientific arguments between scientists. You've got arguments going on between scientists about when life begins. And it's a real argument. It's not between religious people and science people. It's between religious scientists, non-religious scientists versus religious scientists and non-religious scientists disagreeing about what they see. Do you see what I'm saying? So that those arguments are not religion versus science. They're scientists on both sides of the argument. That's all I'm suggesting. And they ought not be left out of the discussion.